Our next session will require a bit more of your concentration, I suppose. At least it did for me when I read through the proposals. The subject is the new grid, balancing transmission, storage, and local energy. And I engaged Ron Sinton to be in a dual role as both a moderator and then a speaker, because he's an excellent person to merge this dense information. So, Ron, if you would get started.
Thank you for coming to this session. So this session will be talking about balancing the new grid. And first, I'll give a few introductory slides, and then we'll get on to our experts. And afterwards, we'll have a bit of a panel discussion and open the questions to the audience for the remainder of the hour. So the first thing I want to show is how things are going here in Colorado. And so on the vertical axis, I'm showing PV in Colorado versus year. And Colorado's grid has been mostly fossil up to this point. Xcel has a lot of experience with wind, and they've been installing a lot of wind so that we're up to about 30%, 38% wind on Xcel's grid. But PV is new in big quantity. And we can see here that in blue, I show what it is for all of Colorado, the percent of our power that we get from PV. And it's been growing since 2015 to 2020. And then we have projections from Xcel from their latest resource plan. And what's really interesting here is that we are here in 2022, and PV is about to triple, from 5% to 15% next year. And after that point, it keeps going up to about 25%, which they're projecting for 2030. And so what does this mean for the grid? And so I've done a visualization using EIA data. And what I'm doing here is if you have renewable as bright green and fossil fuel black as coal, and you plot every hour of the year, 87, 60 hours, and you start at 1 a.m. on January 1st in the upper left-hand corner, and then come down through noon to midnight on January 1st, and then you plot 365 columns of this data, you get a really nice map. And so what we can see here is that in Colorado in 2019, when we had 25% wind, there's no real strong pattern. It's a bit chaotic. You might say that April was a little cleaner. Summer is kind of dirty due to air conditioning peaks, and winter is always a bit of a problem. In the lower graph, I'm showing the percent fossil fuel in the grid for all 24 hours of the day, and you see that in 2019, it was pretty flat. So where are we today in 2022? What we see is that the days are starting to brighten up, and that's from the PV coming online. And if you look at how clean the grid is versus hour of the day, you see that the days are starting to get cleaner. Now let's look at 2023, because this is where the action really happens. There we go. The days are getting much cleaner at 15% PV, and we can see that nights are actually twice as dirty as daytime starting next year, 6 months from now, because of the PV that's being installed now. If you look at Xcel's projections out to 2030, it gets very clean during the day. Its nights are 5 times dirtier than the day. So what does this mean for the grid? If we go back to even 2023, we see a lot of hours that are bright green. And what this means is that the grid could be run at 100% renewable if we knew how to do that. That's a really difficult technical problem. And so that brings us, I'll get this right. So the future is now in Colorado. It's happening this year. It's not a decade out. We have to figure out these problems today. We could be 100% renewable at times if we knew how to do it. Are we ready? And so we brought some experts here today. And first up, we're going to have Nate Blair, who's the group manager in distributed systems and storage analysis at NREL. And he'll talk about how to use storage to balance the grid. And then we'll have Kyri Baker, who's assistant professor of building systems engineering at CU Boulder. So I'll hand it over to Nate next.
Thanks. I'm really happy to be here. In addition to working at NREL, I was on the board for CRES from about 2004 to 2008, so it's always fun to come back and re-engage. Maybe would still be on the board, but we had 3 kids, which tends to distract you from other important things in life. So there we go. So I'd like to start with this slide for people who aren't in the business, and I think you guys are all aware of this, but we wouldn't probably have started on a storage future study if not for the bright orange line, which is the lithium-ion battery pack cost reduction. So over the last decade or so, prices have come down dramatically, made EVs much more possible. We've stopped talking about hydrogen cars, and Elon Musk has made more money than he probably should have. But the point being that this combined with the reduction in costs for PV, for wind, for the emerging offshore wind in the U.S., and a variety of other technologies has really made this an exciting time to work in storage. So I'm going to go through each page of 7 reports. No, I'm just kidding. We have written 7 reports. They're all up on that website. Luckily for you, we also made a slide deck, and in most cases, a webinar. I didn't do all of them, so some of them are pretty good. And so there's a lot of material there if you want to dig a little bit deeper. We don't have time today to even go through all 8 of our key findings. So we're going to talk about 5, which I think are most exciting, and then some of the other ones dig in a little bit deeper. But we've spent about 2 years trying to determine where we're going to go with energy storage. And I think the key headline is we're going to build a lot of it. So, and these are numbers for the U.S. Let me explain the graphs a little bit. We did about, I think, 19 scenarios on the right-hand side. These are not driven with a carbon cap. They're not driven with, got to reach 100% renewables, et cetera. In these scenarios, these are just variations in battery costs in the future, variations in PV costs, wind costs, maybe natural gas, I think, were a couple of the other ones that varied around. And in all cases, even in the lowest case, which means that the battery costs don't decline much more, we still go from about 400 gigawatt hours up to well over 600. So we're building out, if you look at our reference case on the left there, a lot of storage. The 12-hour pumped hydro storage has been here for decades for the most part. And don't build more of that in these scenarios because it is really, really hard to site new pumped hydro facilities. If we could do that, if we could build more, it would be a great resource. We're seeing a lot of current and future build out of batteries. So starting with short duration, 2-hour batteries, then 4, then 6, then 8, then 10. And so as we go to these higher levels, as you see across to the right there. The other thing that we've just concluded, and we're not alone in this, Bloomberg feels this way, lots of people feel this way, is that the cost of batteries is going to continue to come down. So we're seeing an additional maybe 50% cost reduction in the next 10 years. Now, thanks to COVID, I have to say, we did most of this while we were sitting in our basements in 2020. So it doesn't include what I think are going to be some near-term perturbations, right? So you've maybe seen, the cost of lithium has quadrupled or gone up by a factor of 10 or this or that. There are a bunch of supply chain issues in the near term. We think a lot of that will resolve. We think there's a lot of exploration going on for the minerals. We think, that the world will sort of get back on track. So that's maybe a little optimistic, but we see, you have the consumer electronics market, you have the EV market, and you have the grid storage market. It's a unique thing from the grid perspective to have multiple other major markets also pushing on expanding the scope and the scale. So there's a variety of options here. The other thing that I think is interesting is that if you look today in these red circles over here, and say you're a utility and you say, based on our analysis, we need a 200 megawatt, 4-hour battery right here in this part of the grid. Well, today, if you said, should we get 4 hours or 6 hours, the cost difference is really dramatic. It's like $1,500 to $2,250. If you go out into the future when the cost of the battery packs have declined, that additional percentage of cost to go from 4 hours to 6 hours is a lot lower, right? So if you look at the far red circle. And so we're also anticipating that people will buy larger, longer duration technologies just as a hedge, right? So risk reduction. We think we need 4, but everything is uncertain, so maybe we should buy 6. Utilities like to potentially buy more, reduce their risk even more. They're very risk adverse, so we'll see some of that happening. When you think about battery storage or any kind of energy storage, you think about, I'm going to take all this perhaps extra solar or extra energy in the middle of the day. I'm going to move it to the night when the sun's not shining. That time shifting value. And that's an important value for storage. But what this graph is trying to show is that much more important is just the capacity that it provides, right? So we don't know exactly when the sun is going to shine. We've got lots of good forecasts. We're getting there. We don't know exactly how the wind is going to blow. So those two combinations reduce sort of the firm capacity a little bit for PV and wind. Batteries come in and they provide firm capacity throughout all these hours of the year. And that is of more value in our analysis than the time shifting. Together, you get the greatest value, and if you have great value, then the model builds more of it. That's why this is in kind of gigawatts of deployment. So this graph has been around, I think, since before I started at NREL. And it's one of the many graphs that we've used over the years to try to help people understand how do you provide flexibility in the grid so that adding PV, wind, et cetera, to the grid is easier, right? So there's a lot of options here. System operations, services from variable renewable energy. Some of you have been involved with some of these load options, so demand response at different scales, different retail tariffs trying to affect behavior. You can add flexibility to your generators, et cetera, and make them more flexible. The growth of natural gas has actually provided a lot of flexibility to the grid, for example. What we're seeing, if you look at that red box, let's see if this works. It's weird. I can see the green dot, and then I can't. Anyway, over here on the far right, this is where it says electrochemical storage. That used to be at the top of the chart, right? It used to be way up there at the top of the chart. What we have found is that now, because batteries have gotten so much cheaper, it's kind of changed maybe what you want to do to provide this flexibility in the grid. And you may find that it's a cheaper option than some of these other options, which not to say you still don't want to do those, but the ranking of where those flexibility options come into the grid is important. And it speaks to what Ron was saying at the beginning, which is as we get to more and more of this, we've got longer and longer periods where we're already at 100% renewable energy. So this graph, and then I'll stop, is probably the most complicated one, but it's fairly easy to understand, I think. So we've got two graphs here, and they're both speaking to the fact that storage and PV really complement each other. And that's one of the things we found. We found, frankly, that storage and wind, just because of the nature of wind and the fact that it's perhaps more even, the wind doesn't, automatically stop at sunset, for example, is less complementary with storage. So that's kind of intuitive. But what we see here in the left side is that this is for California, and this is hours of the day across the bottom, 0 to 24, and the total gigawatts of load in California, somewhere north of 40, south of 60. If you don't have any solar on the grid, you get that first top curve. Nice, big, flat afternoon peak. And then as you start to add solar, it chews into that peak and chews into it. And what you end up with by that second arrow is a much narrower peak at 20% PV than you had with 0% PV. And you know what is great about a narrow peak period in the day is that you can meet it with a short duration battery. So if you say, hey, my peak is 200 megawatts or 2 gigawatts, and it's 8 hours long, that's a much more expensive battery than it's 2 gigawatts high, but only 2 hours long, right? So you can meet it, if we go back to the cost charts, you can meet it with a much cheaper battery because the peaks are shorter. So now you've peeled back that peak period, and you keep adding solar, and peeled back the peak period, the peak is now wider again. Maybe you add a little more storage or you add more solar, and they kind of keep working together to both shrink and then lop off the peak. So in our modeling, we keep using solar to shrink the peak and then lop it off. And what we found is in those scenarios I talked about, if we have cheap batteries, we get more PV on the system. If we have cheap PV, we get more batteries on the system. They work together to be really synergistic. So, and then the other chart is a little hard to read, but basically it's saying we're moving the time from 2020 on the top bars to 2030 on the bottom bars. We're moving the time in which you charge the battery from maybe early in the morning or in the middle of the night when electricity is cheap to the middle of the day when solar is got too much and therefore electricity is cheap. So, and so feel free, not now because she's going to give a great talk, but later, go to our website and take a look at our other reports. Thank you.
So we'll defer the questions to the panel. And next up, we have Kyri Baker, who's an assistant professor in the Building Systems Engineering at CU Boulder.
Thank you. Looks a little stretched, but we're going to go with it. So we're going to switch gears just a little bit. We've been talking a lot about, transmission, large-scale energy, storage. Let's take a look at distribution, so the low voltage grids where most of the outages occur that supply our homes and buildings. So in general, the grid is actually extremely complex. We talk about it sometimes in terms of like, does hourly generation meet hourly demand? But grid operators actually have to balance supply and demand within milliseconds to keep the lights on. So if you take a look at the voltage or current out of an outlet in this room, you're going to see a oscillating AC waveform going up and down 60 times per second, because in the US grid we have 60 hertz energy. If supply and demand isn't balanced, let's say if a generator trips or if a large factory kicks on a motor, you're going to see a slight either sag in that. It's going to get a little bit slower or it's going to get faster. You might see lights flickering when your AC kicks on in your house, for instance. So this is very, very complicated. We have to balance things extremely quickly. We're also seeing a lot of threats to the power grid. So balancing supply and demand with conventional generators is something that utilities and grid operators are used to doing. They're pretty good at it, given how complicated it is. But we're seeing threats that we didn't foresee 50 years ago. So here's a little plot that I made courtesy of Mountain Parks Electric, which is a rural co-op in Colorado. In 2020, we had a bunch of wildfires in Colorado, as many of you probably remember, some of which got extremely close to people's homes in this rural distribution feeder. So this feeder in particular, I can't tell you exactly where it is, but if those fires got any closer, you can see those customers with the little dots. It would have taken out the one large transmission line and substation supplying those customers. So it's not an easy area to access. It's also not an easy area to supply power to. Wildfires are wreaking havoc in California and a lot of other areas as well, as I'm sure you're familiar with. Just last month, the UK had a record high temperature. So July 2022, the highest temperature ever recorded in the United Kingdom. So we're seeing record-breaking events, grid components are aging, record-breaking number of electrical incidents. So this is not only large-scale outages, but it's also physical attacks on the power grid, widespread voltage issues in the power grid. Generally, the grid is just getting really stressed, as many of us are by climate change. So what are we doing? So instead of just relying on these large-scale power plants, utilities and grid operators are actually starting to take a look at the little players, the demand-side resources, more and more. So traditionally, demand response was sort of, call up an industrial facility or manufacturing plant, say, hey, can you turn off your smelter for the next 2 hours? The grid is pretty heavily loaded. They might have a deal where they get compensated for that. In the 80s and actually even 70s, we started implementing programs that allow residential consumers to participate in these services by putting a switch on their water heater, a switch on their AC compressor, so the utility could leverage that demand in terms of stress. This isn't just a US-specific thing. So this article from 1 week ago in CNN just shows what France is doing, which would be a huge issue if implemented in the US. They're enforcing temperature limits between certain hours. So in the summer, indoor temperatures can't be below 79 degrees, which I don't know about you, but that would be very hard for me to sleep in 79-degree weather. And in the winter, no temperatures can be above 66 degrees. So this kind of introduces philosophical questions related to energy that we didn't think about before. What should a utility have control over in our homes and how we live our lives? This is pretty intense, in my opinion. In the US, of course, we're seeing a little bit more of a gentler approach in most cases. Flex alerts in California, where CalISO might ask you to please, turn off your AC during these hours, otherwise we're gonna have to perform load shedding and disconnect the customers directly. Of course, in ERCOT, Texas's grid, we're very, very familiar with them, these conservation alerts of them asking, pretty please, turn off your AC or turn off your heaters. So these worked pretty well in the beginning. People were like, yeah, I'm gonna help prevent a blackout, I'm gonna help the grid. Now what we're seeing is a lot of people saying, screw you, I wanna keep my AC on, I don't care, ERCOT, get your stuff together. So the demand side does have potential, but in my opinion, we can't just politely ask. It's not gonna work that way. We need to compensate consumers for this. We need to make it easy for consumers and automatic for them to participate. So the metaphor I'm going to use is this. So the title of my talk was The New Grid, Flexible but Complicated. So on the left-hand side, we see what I call the old grid. It's a conductor, it's an orchestra. The conductor is providing a central point for the orchestra to sync to. And on the right-hand side, we see a rock band. And does anybody know who this band is? Yep, Red Hot Chili Peppers. They're not a jam band, which is what I was going for here, but they embody some of the aspects of a jam band. So if you're not familiar with jam bands, you might have a drummer that, starts with a beat, and I just did this last night with my brother. We were playing some music. He's in the Boulder Symphony Orchestra, actually. We were playing some music. He starts with a beat. I've listened to him for a while, then I start with my guitar. We're a little bit off in the beginning, but eventually we started making some beautiful music. So this is the transition that the grid is going through. From the 1870s, way back in the infancy of the grid, it was more centrally controlled. So we had independent system operators like California ISO in the upper top left corner that were responsible for this balancing of supply and demand. You as a customer, just consume what you want. Do whatever you want, live your life. The grid will take care of it. The grid is responsible for coordinating and orchestrating the balance of these resources. What we're seeing now is a lot of distributed energy resources, or DERs. So DERs can encompass things like rooftop solar, home battery systems like the Tesla Powerwall, Nest thermostats, even smart water heaters. And in one case, during my time at NREL, we had a smart oven. I don't know why you need a Wi-Fi connected oven, but that's a thing now. So a lot of these distributed energy resources increasing dramatically. And they're not always visible by the utility. In fact, a lot of utilities don't know where all their poles and wires and transformers are. I had a student whose internship was to drive around and to mark down all the locations of the transformers and poles so the utility could map out where all those things were. So there's no orchestra here. They just have to locally listen, locally balance, and somehow we have to still keep the lights on. So this transition is very, very complex, but there does introduce a level of flexibility that we didn't have before. And so some of the ways that we're utilizing buildings, this is from our old place in East Boulder. This is Excel's saver switch. It's literally a switch that sits on your compressor, and in times of high grid loading, they turn off your AC for a small amount of time. I've literally never noticed the AC turning off. A lot of people don't notice this unless it's for multiple hours, because your house has a lot of thermal mass. It'll stay cool for a decent amount of time. And this is a neighborhood cat, Rocky. She was just on the compressor when I took the picture. So the saver switch is what's called direct load control. So this is the basic form of demand response. The utility goes out, physically installs switches, turns off devices. Customers generally don't like this. We do see high adoption in some areas, like Florida Power and Light has actually had this program for 2 decades, I think now, with a lot of success. But widespread adoption is going to be really, really hard to achieve and to implement, to have somebody go out and install these physical sensors. What we can start doing is possibly relying on software. So when the solar eclipse happened, a lot of people were worried that when that eclipse happened, the solar panels were going to drop in generation. There was going to cause this huge frequency fluctuation from the mismatch in supply and demand. Millions of dollars were pumped into these studies to make sure the grid stayed stable. What Nest did was they just pushed an update to their thermostat that said, hey, do you mind if we turn off your AC just for like 20 minutes while this happens to make sure the grid stays stable? And most people were like, yeah, I'm going to be outside looking at the eclipse anyway. Sure, I'll help the grid. And so this was a lot easier than the physical switches. So controlling these distributed energy resources has a lot of potential, has a lot of flexibility if it's done correctly. Now I'm going to ignore this other plot right now. Okay. Some of the new things I'm really excited about. Really excited about bidirectional charging and discharging of electric vehicles. We saw the benefit of storage from Nate's talk, and we'll probably see the benefit of storage throughout today. Electric vehicles, and I know Scott said this before, are basically large batteries that are existing at people's homes that can provide these local resources. The F-150 can power your home for 3 days or more during a blackout. It's a really huge selling point. These got sold out instantly when it came on they released the pre-order. It's a really big selling point, especially for people in areas where there's a lot of blackouts like Texas and California, hopefully not Colorado. There's a couple bidirectional chargers in Colorado. This is one I visited at the Denver Alliance Center. They basically use it to shave off their peak demand in their building to help them save money on demand charges. If you're not familiar, a lot of commercial buildings get charged a very, very high rate for their peak 15-minute consumption for that month. And that's because that peak consumption drives the sizing of the wires and the sizing of the transformers. They have to be sized for that peak. So lowering that peak is really helpful. It's not just about energy, it's also about the instantaneous power. So a couple discussion points that I like thinking about myself and that I want us to think about today. How do we make the jam band sound good? You know, there are some jam bands that just legitimately never sound good. And maybe I'll go back, oops. Well, okay, I won't go back. Or no, Martin can help me. So maybe I'll go back to that plot I skipped over to address this first question about making the jam band sound good. And what can happen if you don't coordinate these resources well? So let's say you have a bunch of smart thermostats, and they're all programmed, like Nest Rush Hour Rewards program, to pre-cool your house when the electricity is cheap, and then turn off the thermostat when the electricity gets expensive. So let's say you're under a time of use rate. So this plot right here, the dark shaded area shows the high price period. You can see the purple line is when you have 100% smart thermostats, and they're all pre-cooling, because they're all programmed the same way to pre-cool before the high price period. We get an even higher peak on the transformer than before. So we're getting a lot of stress from these distributed energy resources where we could be getting value. Okay, and then the next point is, what are the most effective ways of hardening and making grids more resilient? Distribution grids have by far the most outages. It's just a weaker part of the grid. Trees blow into the lines, squirrels chew on transformers and conductors. It's just a hard thing to deal with. How do we make this better without making it ridiculously expensive? Some people say underground all the lines. That's a great idea, but it's just really expensive and really time-consuming. At the transmission level, we're talking $2+ million per mile to underground a transmission line. And then in particular, I've been at CU I'm starting my 6th year now. I hope to stay here for the rest of my life. I'm really thinking about what I can do to make Colorado grids better. Okay, and I'll end there.
So why don't we come up then and do a panel? Well, actually, I guess I have a talk first.
Yeah, that's right. You have a talk.
Sorry about that.
We'll watch your talk and then we'll come up.
It's only like 5 slides. And because I'm just going to build on my introduction slides and add a few more points along the lines of what both Nate and Kyri said. And what this is when already next year we're going to have power about twice as clean during daytime as night. So what does this mean that we should be doing? And both of these speakers said this, but if night is twice as dirty as day, then obviously if you're an energy efficiency expert, you want to focus on night, because if you can save 1 kilowatt hour at night, you're saving twice as much carbon as during the day. And as we can see from this transition this year, it's pretty easy to clean up day with solar. The second thing is that you want to shift power use into daytime to create more demand so that you install more solar and at the same time clean up night. And you can use the techniques that the speakers said. You can shift it by charging a battery during the day to increase the demand for PV, and you can use the air conditioning controls that Kyri was talking about. So why does this matter? Why do we have to do this right now? And so if you look at Xcel's resource plan, they make some assumptions. And you can barely see this plot on the left, but what it is the total demand that they expect in their area versus year from 2020 to 2048. And they see almost all of the demand growth is going to be in EVs. But they made an assumption about our behavior. They said that all EV charging was going to be at night. And so what does this do? What it means is that when you go to do your resource plan, the computer model will choose gas, because when the wind isn't blowing at night and you're charging EVs, you would supply it with gas. But what if we were a bit smarter than that, and we remember that green stripe down the middle of the day, and we plan to do the EV charging during the day? If you did this, then their computer models would choose PV for future power plants. And what I'm finding, to my surprise, is a bit controversial, is to say that you need to do this preemptively, because the utility has to be convinced that this demand will show up during the day instead of the night. And if you don't convince them, they'll build the gas plant, and then you've spent the money. So the other issue, which is important, is that we can see in 2030, we've got almost 100% renewable energy in the middle of the day, but we're only at 25% wind. And so 25% PV. So the utility, thinking very conservatively, would say that's basically the cap for PV. It's when you have enough PV to meet the demand during the daytime. So it's also our job to show them that they're wrong. That, for example, if you're charging your EVs and you're shifting your heating load into the day in the winter and other things, then we can perhaps take this from 25 to 45% and start working on taking the renewables from 80% all the way to 100%. Now, 2 more slides. Excel is doing its demand response strategic study, and it's on the topics that we've been talking about today, and it basically comes to the same conclusions that I'm showing here. And this is a key figure from this study, which came out less than a month ago. And the vertical axis is the system net load. This is the load minus the renewables that are available. And so, in a sense, it's the fossil fuel plants that you have to fire up to meet the load. And you can see that in 2022, this year, it's almost all in the summer. This is July and August, where all the red crosses are. And I looked at the details here, and all of these critical hours are during daytime. But we know that the PV is going to fix that. So Brettel found the same thing. And in 2030, the critical hours are spread through the entire day. And so it's a totally different system. The way it was presented in the Excel demand study and this study is that this is a problem for 2030. But I'm convinced, and I think I've shown with the data, that it's a problem for next year, that we're already there, and we need to be working on innovating our demand response for that issue. So now we'll take that into the panel. So I invite the panelists up. So I think one of Kyri's discussion questions was right on point, and I was talking to Nate before we started, and he has some things to say about what are the most cost-effective ways of hardening grids, undergrounding lines, upgrading transformers, programs for DERs. You have some experience in Puerto Rico with hurricanes.
Yeah, and I'll let Kylie answer as well because it's her question. But but I will say that we are working with Puerto Rico right now. They have two things going on. One is their grid is unreliable at the moment, and they have, as I'm sure many of you know, a history since Hurricane Maria of having a lot of difficulty maintaining power, and the people on the island are reluctant to trust the utility to provide reliable power in the event of extreme events in the future. So many of them are moving to a PV and storage system for themselves, and you know we talked to the local installers and they said they're flying off the shelf. Like, we can't, it's more of a supply issue than it is a cost issue. Now, that's not true for everybody, right? So we've got a lot of low and moderate income people in Puerto Rico that likely are going to have difficulty affording the upfront payments for all that. So what are the financing options? We also looked at undergrounding some transmission lines. The big one there is vegetation management, right? So you want to cut the trees back so that you don't have, so the wind is just hitting the transmission line, not hitting a tree that then falls on the transmission or distribution line. So, but they've looked at undergrounding. That also has issues. They have a lot of, they've also had earthquakes. I'm certainly not moving to Puerto Rico here, am I? But they've also had earthquakes, and so they've got geological issues with undergrounding lines. They've got flooding. Obviously, they're very close to the ocean level. So there's a number of complicated engineering questions on those options. So,
Do you want to go farther than you did in your talk? On
I
this
do.
topic?
The unsung hero in distribution are transformers. So those cylinders on the power poles or those green boxes in your neighborhood, those are responsible for stepping down the voltage from the high voltage transmission to the low voltage that your house uses, for example, 240, 120 volts. So the transformers are getting pretty old. We're seeing in a lot of areas transformer overloading, which is basically they're overheating because people are pulling too much power and the conductors are aging, so they're not as efficient. And a good analogy is if you look inside a transformer, you'll just see a conductor, a copper wire. If you take a look at your breaker box in your house, you're also going to see a bunch of copper wires. If you plug in 4 hair dryers in your bathroom, it's starting to pull a bunch of electrons. That wire starts to heat up a lot, and it heats up so much that it becomes unsafe and your breaker flips. So at the transformer level, you can think about 4 people on the same transformer plugging in their Ford F-150 after work. We're starting to get a lot of current being pulled through those. We're starting to see transformers overheating. So these are, in some cases, at the large scale, very, very complicated and expensive to replace. A lot of them are custom made. The smaller scale, much easier, but still something that we have to take a look at. So if we're talking about hardening, and if we want to electrify our buildings, got to upgrade those transformers. That's one of the things that keeps me up at night is those robots in disguise. Transformers, robots in disguise, yeah, other type of transformer. But
new technology coming online, solid state transformers, or will it always be copper windings?
I think people are looking at that, but I'm not as familiar with the new technology. I think just replacing them. Utilities typically have a run to failure model. So when you see the little pops, when the transformer pops, yeah, they're going to go out and replace it, but we need to preemptively harden some of those.
So maybe the next one I'll ask Nate first, that we see critical demand peaks for electricity shifting from summer into winter. So should storage be in the form of heat for heat loads? Or you talked mostly about batteries, about storing electricity as electricity and then returning it as electricity.
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways to look at this problem. My father-in-law has a house, a retirement house in Wisconsin with 4 or 5 big solar thermal panels on the roof, and I started years ago at the University of Wisconsin studying solar water heating, and I think there's a question of the basic engineering of what's the most efficient thing to do and what's the smart thing to do from an engineering standpoint. There's also the question of what's the economic thing to do and what's the thing you can do quickly from the market standpoint. So I think it would be great if moving forward we made some of these heat storing options that are out there, either a rock bed or a water tank, or we talked about ice storage, I think, a little bit. Some of these technologies as an option for builders as they build out particularly larger facilities. Is very hard to retrofit much of that into an existing home or apartment building or other facility. And so that's why I think a lot of people are in the HVAC industry that care about these things are very excited about heat pump water heaters, heat pump furnaces, and geothermal heat pumps as well, although that's another higher cost point for most people. So you're seeing the Europeans now with the war going on moving very quickly to try and put in heat pump furnaces before next winter to reduce natural gas use, et cetera. So I think it would be great to store some level of heat. I just think for existing buildings, it's very difficult to find the space. And for economic reasons, it's hard to move the market in that direction.
So if you have questions, why don't you raise your hand and someone will pass you a microphone. But in the meantime, I'll ask one last question to Kyri. I kind of showed Excel's plan through 2030, which is maybe 5 to 10% distributed power. What is your vision for, let's say, 2035, and how might we see this kind of change our homes and our lives?
I think the biggest underestimated thing right now is electric vehicle adoption. I think that's going to be far surpassing expectations right now. And I think there are companies popping up that incentivize people to charge, off-peak and to use their EV more as a battery system. But that's one of the biggest areas for distributed energy resources, is just how can we utilize homes that have rooftop PV, big batteries that aren't just stationary batteries just for the PV. They're also dual use for transportation and for powering your home during a blackout. And then demand response. I view demand response more as sort of a Band-Aid. It's hopefully not a long-term solution to have utilities turning off your air conditioner, but if it's that or cutting off power to, multiple customers, the turning off the AC is an attractive option.
Okay, so let's go to a couple questions.
Hi, and thank you for all your very illuminating conversations this morning. My one question relates to, I haven't heard much about the former Dr. Lovins' negawatt or deep retrofits. I'm hearing substitution and saving, but not deep retrofits to take away demand.
Yeah, so I'm from the Building Systems program, and most of the history of our program has focused on energy efficiency, reducing demand. As I think we saw from Ron's plot, it's not always, reducing demand is good, energy efficiency is good, but now it's more about aligning demand with renewable production. In a lot of areas like West Texas or in California, we have so much renewable generation that prices are dipping negative every day. They're paying people to consume more energy. So now it's more about overlapping that energy and having flexible demand than it is about reducing. But reducing is still important, of course.
I think it's especially important at night in the future.
Yeah.
I would add that I think that the Department of Energy has continued to invest and grow their investment, particularly in low-income insulation programs, WIP, some of these other programs, and I think that there's some progressive action on that front. I also think building codes and building code enforcement is a push for Department of Energy right now. I know Secretary Granholm was down giving it to some of the building code people at their convention recently, like why aren't we building these buildings better than we were 40 years ago? So
We have a question back here.
That same question applies to Louisville, where I'm from. We had the fire and 1,000 or so houses burned down, and I was hopeful that the rebuilding codes would require more smart homes, but apparently they're relaxing that because, of course, people are complaining about the extra cost. So I don't know how we deal with that. But I have 3 questions. They're going to be quick. I saw a webinar on capacitors, industrial-sized capacitors. Do they play a role in filling some of these energy gaps? Question number 2, if you use my EV for battery supply, how do you prevent it from being empty when I get up in the morning? And I think Excel's peak charge is during the day until 8 p.m. So that would vote against charging my EV during the day. How do we deal with that? Thanks.
The energy efficient and building codes and upgrading buildings. One thing we haven't been talking about is life cycle carbon, embodied carbon. Some of the energy and carbon that's built into producing some of these high performance materials for buildings, if you look at the whole life cycle, actually ends up being worse for the environment than a less well insulated building that's using cleaner materials. So that's not my area, but that's one thing that I've been thinking about. What was your second question? Oh, the capacitors. Okay, so capacitors, I teach intro to circuits. I'm going to try not to get too technical, but there's different types of power, right? There's active power, which actually performs work, and then there's reactive power that cycles back and forth, takes up space in power lines. Capacitors only provide reactive power, so most of their utility is in providing voltage support to different parts of the grid. They're near the edges of distribution grids to boost up the voltage to make sure it's 240, 120. They're not necessarily for large-scale generation because of that fact. They can only generate reactive power.
I could deal with the third question, which is time of use rates. And it's most important that the utility actually look forward so that they can anticipate what we'll have next year. And so we're going to have a TOU rate that was designed for the fossil grid for a few years, and then they'll figure it out. And the Public Utility Commission put out a ruling telling them to figure it out recently.
Maybe I'll touch on the vehicle to grid question. There's this scenario where the guy gets up and his car is dead and he's like, screw it, I'm off this program, right? So that's very real. I think the thing that I've heard recently is it's one thing if your car is an older electric car and it maybe has 80 miles of range and the utility pulls out 40 miles, you're kind of maybe stuck the next day. If you have 400 miles of range, which people are estimating over the next 10 years, EVs will get there, then they pull out 40 miles, you probably wouldn't even notice necessarily the next day, right? So there's a number of moving pieces on that front. The other thing with vehicle to grid that we've talked about for years is that it accelerates the degradation of the battery, right? So the more you use a battery, it starts to wear out eventually. We've all seen that with our cell phones. But that's also a moving target because the degradation for some of the new technologies for batteries is kind of starting to go down. So I think in the near term, my conventional wisdom at least, I won't speak for everybody, but is that this value of backup power and having a battery that's 4 times the size of a power wall sitting in your garage that you can use to run your refrigerator if there's a outage is a viable pathway forward. Tesla wants to sell you not only a car, but also a Powerwall. So they're not maybe as excited about this as some of the other manufacturers are. But that's a viable thing. I see that as a separate service than pulling power in and out of your battery on a regular basis or a daily basis to support the grid, which I think is less likely in the near term.
Martin's probably going to tell us when we should quit.
Yeah, I guess it was similar to his question because Xcel Energy gives a $50 credit if you charge like between 9 p.m. and 9 a.m. or whatever. You know, if you stay on there, which is overnight, which is the opposite of what you said in your presentation. I do have solar panels. I work from home. I could charge during the day. But also keep in mind that the peak time is going to be overnight because people sleep and people are out and about during the day normally. And so unless we have more charging stations at work or something, where do you expect people to charge if they're not charging overnight while they sleep?
I think that's just the point, that you want infrastructure to be built to complement the grid that we will have in the future. I think we have one from Tracy Burnett.
I'm Tracy Burnett. I'm a Colorado State Representative for Eastern Boulder County, House District 12. You are one of my constituents. And I just have to say, first of all, I love being here. You guys are my kind of people. I did a building energy efficiency, building energy codes bill this last year that should address some of your issues about how can we do more charging. And I also did a microgrid roadmap bill to help with grid resiliency. And last year I did one on embodied carbon. So you guys are my issue. Right now, right now I'm working with Ron on time of renewables. And my question is, I'm talking to industry, I'm talking to Excel, all those different people. My question is, how do we get a bill out of this? What demand do we need from individuals and industry to have Excel open up their kimono and tell us when they are going to have, on a very micro scale, when they're going to have those renewables available? What industries need this? Please help me with that. And I want to form a working group with you guys, by the way, to figure this out.
A little secret, Tracy Burnett is one of our Climate Courage event awardees, so we'll hear a little more from her later. Tons of questions in the room, but I think we need to wrap it up here, and you have some time to ask your questions in person outside the plenary. Thank you.